The point of this talk is to open a debate into the relationship between the various actors who directly or tangentially impact on human rights, with a particular reference to the business community. And for this purpose, I intend to include within the human rights envelope almost anything where injustice is perpetrated. Be it lack of education, water, food, be it land rights abuse, or gender, race, colour, or creed discrimination, and of course other things. My interest in this stems from a practical challenge. About a year ago, following on what I just told you earlier, I joined the board of the Global Fund for Human Rights. You may be aware of it. It's a sort of mini version of HRW. The fund is a DC-based NGO, and as the name suggests, funds on-the-ground activists in 17 countries, including Guatemala, Sierra Leone, Burma, Pakistan, and so on. It supports defenders of human rights across land, LGBTI, women's, children's, and other rights. And when I say it's on the ground, it is on the ground. So it is different in that sense from HRW or Amnesty, who are what I would call top-down NGOs. This is a sort of bottom-up NGOs. It's actually providing small amounts of money, $50,000 a year, to small groups fighting exactly the issues that I've just talked about. And more recently, it has been engaged in some thematic work around the closing of civil space in countries like Egypt, where much of that's needed. I suppose I'd categorise this as a mid-sized organisation with a revenue of a bit short of $14 million. If I give you an idea, Human Rights Watch has a revenue of about $80 million, and Oxfam, not it's a human rights organisation, it's a humanitarian organisation, significantly more than that. For a number of reasons, in part to do with structural size, and that's really about organisation, but mostly to do with a very high conviction, and in a sense, I've been quite a big catalyser about this, because having come in from Fresh, I sort of feel very strongly about this, that we should be doing, i.e. the fund should be doing, more of what we do. It does some really great work, and it makes real difference to real people's lives on the ground. And it's quite measurable in many ways, where some of the bigger human rights organisations, it's a bit intangible, it's a bit difficult to know exactly what change HRW is doing. Whereas at the Global Fund, we really can win court cases against bad guys in Guatemala who've been doing bad things, and we send them to prison. So in that sense, it's quite sort of visceral and tangible. The idea is to double the size of the organisation in money flows over the next 5 to 7 years or so. So that's the role. My role was purely a kind of functional role. I'm an entrepreneur, so I know how to grow businesses from small to something big. So my organisation started with just me in a packing box and is now a pretty sizable size business. So I kind of know how to do the transition, and that's essentially why they wanted me, for probably no other reason at all. But most of what I bring to them is purely functional. It's putting in place the necessary plumbing, so that's kind of management structures and financial reporting and corporate governance and all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, as Geoffrey rightly says, it is about money. And this has led me and others to have to think about the sources of funding for the fund itself. At present, about 90% of the fund's funding comes from foundations, whether it's the Ford Foundation, the Rousing Trust, Wellspring, and so on. The problem that we face is that these foundations are largely tapped out, and therefore we're going to have to look for money elsewhere to achieve the objective, which is double the size of the thing. The choices, unless anybody else in this room can think of something different, are pretty limited, actually. So it's governments in some shape or form, it's private individuals, philanthropists, and lastly, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail, corporates. Before considering these options, it's worth pointing out the self-evident, that the integrity of the fund is paramount. And it's not just this fund, it's all human rights organisations, I would say. We simply cannot take money from any source which would compromise the ethical standing and independence of the fund. Sources of funding have to be unimpeachable and verifiably so, and so that no donor can have influence over any stance we might take, or even worse, exert some form of coercion. This principle is sacrosanct, and there is a real understanding amongst the management and we on the board that if we compromise on this, it will spell the end of the organisation. It really literally cannot survive.